Welcome to this episode of Industry Insights. I'm Dr. Darin Detwiler, and we're talking sustainable development. Today we're talking with Dr. Tara Duffy. Welcome, Dr. Duffy.
Yep.
And Dr. Duffy, will you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, hi everybody. So I am an associate teaching professor in the Marine and Environmental Science Department at Northeastern University. I work in part by teaching out at the Coastal Sustainability Institute, which is our marine science center, which is located right outside of Boston, about 40 miles north, a 40-minute drive, excuse me. Sometimes it feels like it's a 40-mile drive. And I teach in what's called our 3 Cs program, where students are earning a master's in marine biology. So my background is in marine and atmospheric science. That's what my Ph.D. is in. I know very little about the atmosphere, but I spend a lot of time thinking about how humans impact fish populations through things like overfishing, through aquaculture, through food production. And I teach a course called Food Security and Sustainability at Northeastern.
Let's talk a little bit about perhaps a more scientific look at sustainability. You know, we need food. Population grows, and so we'll just get more food out of the planet, right? We just got to work harder. That's all we got to do, right?
Yeah, the fastest growing food sector is food production from aquatic environments. A lot of it is coming from inland aquaculture, so aquaculture in freshwater in places like China, South America, Africa. And when you break that down, actually, the majority of food, or the fastest growing place where we're producing more food, is in seaweed aquaculture. So growing seaweed, which is a great thing. It's used for lots of things. Not a great source of protein, but a really good source of micronutrients. So there's a lot of potential there for meeting things like nutrient deficiencies with the culture of seaweed.
Is it easy to just increase our crop yields of seaweed? And what about seafood? Can't we just increase the amount of seafood that we put into the market?
We have many cases where we have overfished populations. In New England, taking from Boston, the classic case is we have overfished cod populations. So interestingly, if you go back to these what are called indigenous or Native American middens, basically these are trash heaps, places where indigenous peoples in the Northwest Atlantic, living in Maine and Massachusetts, where they took their trash and discarded it. You can go back and you can look at the layers of that trash, and in there you find the bones from fish. You find like the vertebrae from cod. And based on the size of those vertebrae, those indigenous peoples were eating cod that were 6 feet or more in length, right? And they were abundant. And you would be hard pressed to ever find a cod that size these days. And in fact, in many places in the Northwest Atlantic, the cod fishery has been closed because we have overfished to a point where there aren't enough to sustain any economically what's the word I'm looking for? They're basically economically extinct in the region, and they haven't rebounded. And so their understanding of why they have not rebounded is still changing. We don't know why. We stopped fishing. Why haven't they come back? And there are a lot of hypotheses out there and a lot of evidence that suggests, there's lots of things at play. But we've done that over the world, right? We increased demand on the food in the oceans. And then when we, as humans, we move from one species to another, and about 3 decades ago, there's a fishery scientist named Daniel Pauly who coined the term fishing down the food web. So basically we go to as humans, we want the big fish, right? We want the tuna and the sharks and the big grouper. And then when we've wiped those out, we move on to smaller fish, snapper, and then we move on to smaller and smaller things. And eventually we're moving down the food web and we're left with jellyfish and microbes. So, that's a very extreme look at how things can play out. But it has certainly played out to some extent like that in many regions around the world.
I know from my experience living in the Pacific Northwest that it's not just a convenience, when someone fishes too much or claims too much ownership of that commodity. You're impacting people's way of life. The native populations who have literally treaties signed by this country saying that they have access to these lands or these waters or to these populations of fish. We can't just corporate go in there and supersede those treaties and outfish the people who that's part of their culture, that's part of their way of life. So there's so many elements here in the balance. What is something that we're not talking about in terms of this bigger balance?
The wild fisheries, so going out and fishing for salmon, right? Making sure we are allocating catches to those tribal nations. It's not a sustainable, nor it is a regenerative goal. That's a term that I actually really like to talk about in class. We may be meeting some status quo, but it's really not going to help to meet the needs of potentially 10 billion people on the planet by the end of the century. So aquaculture, I think, is going to be incredibly valuable. It is incredibly valuable, but I think it's going to become even more valuable in terms of meeting food security needs throughout the world. Many forms of aquaculture are very good and easy to produce forms of protein. So there are species that we can grow, groups of animals that we can grow, like mussels and clams that are filter feeders. They're incredibly nutrient dense. They are filter feeders, which basically means they're feeding on microscopic algae. They're feeding on plankton that are already in the water. You don't have to add food in order to grow them. And they're also helping in that process when they're cleaning out the algae out of that system, they're also helping to take excess nutrients out of that system. And so growing those kinds of organisms is going to be really important to meet the protein demands of a growing planet. But then you can also grow in freshwater things like carp and tilapia, which, doesn't sound like a great, particularly appetizing fish to a lot of people. But many people around the world value these fish. They like the taste of these. The carp, for example, in the United States, they were introduced from Europe by colonial settlers who came over and they wanted to eat something that they had eaten before. So they were introduced and they're an invasive species in the United States now. But you can grow them, these particular fish, you can grow them because they feed on what's already in the water column. They're rooting around for little organisms that live in the sediment, and they're eating aquatic plants. And so you don't have to add anything. You don't have to add extra food, because many of the the fish species that we like as humans, the salmon, the tuna, they eat other fish. And so if you're going to grow those, you have to, if you're going to aquaculture them, you have to find fish to supplement their diet. And that just becomes another issue of overfishing certain species. And it becomes an issue of basically raising fish that are energy intensive, and usually energy intensive in the form of fossil fuel use.
We often read about a great deal of science has gone into traditional land-based agriculture. When we look at nitrogen and soil quality and genetically modified genetic engineering of foods to maximize yield and to be more resilient and pest resistant and all that kind of stuff. What is an equivalent to that when it comes to aquatic food?
Yeah, so there are very similar conversations about how we raise food in the ocean to what we are doing on land. So this includes genetic modification, includes how do we get food sources that are sustainable for the aquaculture. where do we site these locations? So where are the best places to place these aquaculture farms so that we're not negatively impacting the habitat or the ecosystem around there? And the selection of species, right? So like we select species of plants to grow because they are calorie dense, because they have lots of starches, they store well, right? And so some of the similar things are happening with the species that we are aquaculturing. You know, we want things that are going to grow relatively quickly and easily, and without many inputs, but also store for a long time. You know, seaweeds or algae are a really good example of this. You can dry it out, you can store it, you can ground it down into a powder, and then you can extract what you want from it later on. We all consume seaweed. It's in things like toothpaste that we use every day, hopefully every day. Yeah, so there's a lot of, I shouldn't say there's a lot, right? Like you mentioned, we have spent basically centuries trying to figure out how to farm best on land, and not a huge amount of time trying to figure out how to farm in the ocean.
Well, speaking of time,
yeah.
is this timeline, if you will, in terms of the sea now being impacted, just like we see in other places, by global warming and climate change?
Yeah, and in many cases, you know, these impacts are profound. They have already happened. For example, the Gulf of Maine. So the Gulf of Maine extends from Massachusetts all the way up through Maine. And this is a body of water that is one of the most rapidly warming and acidifying regions on the planet in terms of the changes in the ocean. And so there are major concerns about what is going to happen to the shellfish industries, to things like clams that fishermen rely on to grow up there. And then, you know, we see impacts. I think we're getting a bigger view of what's going on in terms of how fish, for example, respond to changes in temperature, to changes in acidification. For something like a clam that really needs to live in a very specific pH environment, when you take that little teeny tiny clam larvae that's, you know, 2 or 3 millimeters, and you stick it into water that's more acidic, it can't maintain that shell, it can't grow that shell. And so that you could lose an entire industry with very, very minor changes in pH. And in some cases, there are documented cases of collapse of clam populations being able to reproduce, likely due to changes in pH. Fish, it's a little more, because fish have a little more complicated physiology, right? They don't have the bony things on the outside protecting them, but they do have, they did evolve in a very stable pH environment. So we are seeing these changes, and it's going to become much more of a concern in the next 30 to 40 years, not sooner. I strongly believe that the oceans and freshwater systems, what little are left, or few that are left that are still in relatively good shape, are really going to be absolutely essential for food production. So from a sustainability standpoint, being able to meet the demands of an increasing population, making sure that we are protecting the waters that we have left, right? Preserving them so that they don't become more polluted and we cannot use them to grow wild foods, but then to consider, like, how can we grow these foods in a regenerative way that maybe meets multiple ecosystem services. So this concept that the ecosystem is providing these services to us as humans, but we can do this in such a way, by understanding the systems, we can do this in such a way that we can protect not just food and food access, but all of these other systems, like access to fresh water for drinking and other uses. control of and protection of our shorelines, for example. So there is definitely a way to understand these systems, integrate food production, and do it in such a way that we are getting multiple benefits out of the system without further taxing it with the growing population. It can be done. And it's up to people like you guys in this class to think about the ways in which it can be done. I think that's the key, right? Is like we need to get creative, and we can all get creative together to sort of solve these issues.
Dr. Tara Duffy, thank you very much for talking with us today. And I think you've given us a lot to consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Detwiler. This was a pleasure.